The plane shuddered as it hit another patch of turbulence, rattling the ice cubes in my half-empty glass of scotch. I tightened my grip on the armrest, trying to focus on the steady hum of the engines rather than the storm outside. Beside me, Rachel sat stiffly, her manicured fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on her phone screen. She wasn't texting, not anymore. Instead, she just stared at the screen, scrolling back and forth over the same message. Across the aisle, Mark Turner, CEO extraordinaire and the star of every business magazine for the past decade, reclined in his seat with all the ease of a man who believed the world owed him something. His tailored suit didn't wrinkle, and his Rolex caught the light just enough to make sure everyone noticed. The corners of his mouth twitched upward in a smirk, his gaze flicking to Rachel every so often. I noticed the tension between them before, but I dismissed it. I murmured under my breath. The words were for no one but myself, an admission I wished I'd made sooner. The flight attendant appeared at my elbow, a polite smile plastered on her face as she handed me an envelope. "Mr. Carter? This is for you." "For me?" I frowned, taking the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, and it bore no return address. Rachel stiffened beside me, her hand freezing mid-scroll. Turner's smirk widened. The turbulence outside suddenly seemed insignificant. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper, its words typed in bold, efficient font. To the man in seat 12C, not everything is as it seems. Check her messages. Your wife and the CEO aren't here for work. My stomach twisted into a knot, and my hand trembled as I folded the note back into the envelope. I turned to Rachel, who had gone pale, her phone clutched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes darted to me, wide and panicked, and for the first time, I saw it. The guilt, the fear, the truth she had been hiding. "What's this?" I asked, my voice low but firm, as I held up the envelope. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her gaze flicked briefly to Turner, who was now casually flipping through a glossy in-flight magazine, as though the drama unfolding across the aisle had nothing to do with him. "Rachel," I repeated, sharper this time, "what is this?" The flight hit another jolt of turbulence, but this time, it wasn't the plane that made my stomach drop. It was the sinking realization that my world, once so stable, so perfect, was spiraling out of control. I thought back to the late nights she'd spent at the office, the sudden shopping sprees, the carefully vague answers when I asked about her day. I wanted to believe it wasn't true. I wanted to believe this was some cruel prank. But as Rachel avoided my gaze and Turner's smirk grew bolder, the pieces started falling into place. I should have seen it sooner. But now there was no going back. Before the turbulence at 30,000 feet, my life felt as solid as the foundation of a house I had carefully designed. A perfect balance of love, family, and success. Rachel and I built that life together, brick by brick, year after year. At least that's what I believed. I still remember the first time I saw her. It was at a coffee shop near campus, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she argued with a barista over the ethical sourcing of coffee beans. She was sharp, passionate, unapologetically confident, the kind of woman who could command a room without saying a word. I was smitten, and against all odds, she chose me. The architect with modest dreams and a knack for sketching futures out of thin air. We married young, promising each other the world. Over the years, we made good on that promise. A cozy home in the suburbs, 2 kids who were our pride and joy, and careers that complemented each other. While I found fulfillment in designing homes that became sanctuaries for others, Rachel climbed the corporate ladder, blazing trails in an industry dominated by men. I was proud of her, so proud, in fact, that I overlooked the little things, like how her laughter became rare at the dinner table or how her phone always seemed to be glued to her hand. At the time, I chalked it up to stress. After all, her job was demanding, and I was her biggest cheerleader. She's doing this for us? I'd tell myself when she missed yet another soccer game or came home after bedtime with the faint scent of champagne clinging to her clothes. Mark Turner entered our lives 2 years ago, during one of Rachel's company galas. He was everything I wasn't. Flashy, commanding, larger than life. the kind of man who could make anyone feel small in his presence. Rachel introduced him as her new boss, and I shook his hand, feeling an inexplicable chill despite his warm smile. "Your wife's one of the sharpest minds I've ever worked with," he said, patting me on the shoulder as if he were bestowing some grand compliment. "You're a lucky man." At the time, I agreed. But even then, there were moments that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The way Rachel seemed to light up around him, the private jokes they shared, the business trips that became more frequent. I convinced myself it was harmless. "Mark's just a mentor," she'd say with a dismissive wave of her hand. And I believed her because I wanted to, because the alternative was unthinkable. The first real crack appeared 6 months ago when Rachel started coming home later than usual. "Meetings ran over," she'd explain, tossing her heels aside and collapsing on the couch. I tried not to notice the subtle changes, the new wardrobe, the sudden interest in expensive perfume, the way she started keeping her phone face down on the table. Then came the credit card charges. Dinners at restaurants we'd never been to, gifts from high-end boutiques I hadn't seen in the house. When I asked about them, she brushed me off with practiced ease. "Work perks," she'd say with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Deep down, I knew something was wrong, but I buried those feelings, choosing to focus on the good. The way she still kissed me on the cheek before leaving for work, the rare evenings we spent together watching old movies. I clung to those moments like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood, desperate to believe that our life was still whole. Looking back, the signs were all there. The late-night calls she took in hushed tones, the weekends she claimed to spend at networking events. Even our children noticed her growing distance. "Is Mom mad at us?" our youngest, Emily, asked one night after Rachel skipped dinner for the 3rd time that week. "No, sweetheart," I lied, pulling her into a hug. "She's just busy." But the truth was I didn't know. I didn't know what had changed or why. I only knew that the woman I had built my life around was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. The morning of the flight, Rachel had been unusually quiet. She packed her bags without the usual chatter about meetings or itineraries, and when I offered to drive her to the airport, she hesitated before agreeing. As I loaded her suitcase into the car, I noticed a gift bag tucked beneath the flap, a luxury brand I didn't recognize. "Who's this for?" I asked, my tone light but my curiosity sharp. "Just a client," she said quickly, taking the bag and placing it on her lap as if guarding a secret. I wanted to press her, to ask why she seemed so distant, but I didn't. Instead, I kissed her goodbye and told her I'd see her soon, never imagining that the storm brewing inside her would collide with mine at 30,000 feet. The night it all began, I was sitting in our living room, going over blueprints for a project that had taken up most of my week. The fireplace crackled softly, casting warm light across the room. Rachel was curled up on the couch with her phone in hand, her face illuminated by the cool, artificial glow of the screen. It was a scene so familiar, so comforting in its normalcy, that I almost missed the shift in her demeanor. She wasn't scrolling aimlessly like she usually did. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her eyes darted across the screen with a focus that felt out of place for casual browsing. I brushed it off at first, reminding myself that she was juggling multiple deadlines at work. But when her phone buzzed and she tilted the screen away from me, something inside me stirred, an unease I couldn't quite shake. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She glanced up, startled, as if I'd caught her mid-act. "Yeah, just a work thing," she replied quickly, her voice a little too high-pitched to be casual. I nodded, trying to let it go. But as I returned to my blueprints, the feeling lingered. Later that night, as Rachel got ready for bed, she left her phone on the kitchen counter. It was rare for her to leave it unattended, and for a moment, I debated whether I should even look at it. Trust was the foundation of our marriage, wasn't it? But the gnawing unease had grown into something sharper, something I couldn't ignore. I picked up her phone, hesitating only briefly before tapping the screen. The lock screen lit up, and there it was, a text notification from a contact simply labeled M. "Can't wait to see you tonight, M." My heart sank. For a moment, I stared at the message, hoping I'd misread it or that there was some innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew better. I set the phone down carefully, as if handling something fragile, and stepped back, my mind racing. Rachel walked in moments later, her hair damp from the shower. She saw me standing there, my face undoubtedly betraying the storm of emotions brewing inside me. "John, what's wrong?" "Nothing," I lied, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "Just tired." She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and went to bed. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the phone long after she had fallen asleep. The text was the first domino to fall, but it wasn't the last. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing everything I'd overlooked before. The luxury bracelet she wore to a dinner party, a gift I hadn't bought. The sudden interest in private jet charters, which she casually mentioned as a perk of working under Mark Turner's leadership. She became more guarded, her phone always within arm's reach, her excuses more rehearsed. I began to feel like an intruder in my own marriage, watching from the sidelines as my wife drifted further away. Mark Turner's name came up more often than I cared to hear. She spoke about him with admiration, almost reverence, praising his leadership and vision. "He's just so driven," she'd say. "You could learn a thing or two from him." The words stung, but I buried the hurt, pretending it didn't matter. I convinced myself it was professional respect, nothing more. Yet, every time I saw them together, at company events, dinners, or even in passing, it was clear that Mark wasn't just her boss. He was a presence in her life, larger than he had any right to be. One evening, I confronted her about the bracelet. "It's beautiful," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Where did you get it?" Rachel's hand instinctively moved to cover it. "Oh, this? It was a gift from the team for hitting a big milestone." "Nice team," I said, forcing a smile. "They have great taste." She laughed nervously, but her eyes didn't meet mine. The moment passed, but the unease didn't. It grew, spreading like a shadow across every corner of our life. By the time we boarded the flight, I was no longer the man I had been. The man who trusted his wife implicitly, who believed in the strength of their bond. I had become someone else. Someone who questioned everything, who saw betrayal in every glance, every whisper. Sitting beside Rachel on that turbulent flight, the cryptic text replayed in my mind like a broken record. Mark Turner, with his smug grin and air of untouchable confidence, was more than a boss. He was a threat, and Rachel, the woman I had built my life around, was slipping further into his orbit. I should have said something then, should have confronted her before it reached this point. But I didn't. I waited, hoping for an explanation that never came. And then the flight attendant handed me the envelope. The text was just the beginning. I told myself I was imagining things, that my suspicions were born from stress or paranoia. But the doubt didn't go away. It grew, gnawing at me with every passing day. I needed answers, and I was no longer willing to wait for Rachel to give them to me. I started small, almost timidly, by glancing at her calendar when she left it open on the kitchen counter. Her schedule was packed, meetings, dinners, and overnight trips. At first, it seemed normal, just the demands of her high-profile job. But one trip caught my eye. A weekend in Miami, labeled simply as conference. Rachel had mentioned nothing about it, and when I casually asked about her weekend plans, she brushed it off with a vague, "Just work stuff. You know how it is." The next morning, I searched her suitcase before she left. Nestled between neatly folded blouses and tailored slacks was a pair of heels I'd never seen before. Louboutin, the kind you didn't wear for business. Beside them was an envelope containing 2 first-class tickets. Both were under her name and Mark Turner's. The next few weeks were a blur of discoveries. It felt like pulling a loose thread, each tug unraveling the life I thought we had. A credit card statement showed charges at upscale restaurants I'd never heard of, let alone visited. A boutique in Paris she had no reason to shop at. Then came the photo. I found it in a shared folder on her laptop, buried deep among company files. It was of Rachel and Mark, standing arm in arm on the steps of a private jet. She wore the Louboutin heels, her smile radiant. Mark's hand rested possessively on her lower back. The file name was innocuous, boarding.jpg, but the image itself was anything but. The weight of the evidence crushed me. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My chest felt tight, as though my heart had been wrapped in barbed wire. Yet I said nothing. I didn't confront Rachel, not yet. I needed more proof, more certainty. Or maybe I just needed time to accept that the woman I loved was betraying me. At night, I lay awake beside her, listening as she tapped away on her phone. Sometimes, she'd laugh softly, a sound that used to warm me but now sent a chill down my spine. One night, I followed her voice to the kitchen. She was on the phone, her tone light and flirtatious. I stayed in the shadows, just out of sight, and strained to hear. "Mark," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of intimacy I hadn't heard in years. "No one suspects a thing." My knees nearly buckled. I gripped the wall for support, the words echoing in my mind like a death knell. No one suspects a thing. She ended the call and returned to bed, oblivious to my presence. I stood in the darkened kitchen, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind racing. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, it was a fact. The next day, I skipped work and drove to the office building where Rachel and Mark worked. From my parked car, I watched them emerge together, laughing as they walked to his car. He opened the door for her, and she slid in with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. I followed them to a restaurant downtown, one I recognized from the receipts. They sat in a corner booth, their heads bent close together. She reached across the table and touched his hand. It wasn't just a moment of affection. It was ownership, a silent declaration that she belonged to him. That night, as I lay awake once more, I realized something had shifted inside me. The pain, the disbelief, they were still there, but now they were accompanied by something else. Anger, determination. I wasn't going to let this end me. Rachel might think no one suspected a thing, but she was wrong. I knew. And soon, she and Mark would know just how wrong they had been. The plane hummed steadily beneath us, a deceptive calm masking the storm brewing within me. Rachel sat beside me, her hands clutching her phone as if it were a lifeline, her knuckles pale and tight. Across the aisle, Mark Turner lounged in his first-class seat, exuding the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences in his life. His eyes flicked to Rachel every now and then, a silent message passing between them. It was a language I didn't understand but now knew existed. The envelope sat on my lap, its weight far greater than the paper inside. It wasn't just an anonymous note. It was confirmation of what I had suspected for months, maybe years. My grip tightened around it as I stared out the window, trying to steady the rage coursing through me. But the steady hum of the engines did nothing to quiet the cacophony in my mind. "How long, Rachel?" My voice broke the silence, low and steady, but it cut through the cabin like a blade. "How long have I been the fool in your little game?" Rachel turned to me, her face a mask of practiced confusion. "What are you talking about, John?" "Don't," I snapped louder this time. Heads turned in our direction, curious glances from the other passengers breaking the bubble of our private turmoil. I didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see the truth unravel. I pulled the note from the envelope and held it up between us. Explain this." Her eyes widened, darting from the note to my face. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is what it says. Your wife and the CEO aren't here for work." I let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow to the fragile lie she had constructed. "So tell me, Rachel, what are you here for?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the perfect imitation of a fish out of water. "John, it's not what you think," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "Oh, really?" I leaned closer, my anger boiling over. "Because what I think is that you've been lying to me, to our kids, to everyone who believed in you." "So, Rachel, enlighten me. What is it, if not what I think?" Her gaze dropped to her lap, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken. And then, like a serpent slithering into view, Mark Turner leaned forward. "John," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "You're upset. I get it. But let's not do this here." "Shut up," I hissed, my words venomous. "This isn't about you." "Oh, but it is," he countered, his smirk widening. "You'll thank me one day for showing her what real love looks like." The audacity of his words struck like a slap, and I felt a surge of heat rush to my face. The cabin around me seemed to fade, the other passengers becoming nothing more than shadows. All that existed in that moment was him, his smug, self-assured grin, and the woman who had once been my world, sitting silently beside me. "Real love," I echoed, my voice rising. "You think what you're doing is love? Destroying a family? Manipulating her into believing you're some kind of savior?" Rachel flinched at my words, but still, she said nothing. Her silence was the final nail in the coffin, sealing the truth I had tried so hard to avoid. "You don't love her," I spat at Mark. "You love the game, the power, the thrill of taking something that doesn't belong to you. But here's the thing, Mark, you didn't take her. She gave herself to you. And you know what? You can have her." I turned to Rachel, my voice breaking despite my resolve. "You made your choice, Rachel. You chose him, his money, his status. But don't you dare act like this is anything but betrayal." The cabin was silent now, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Rachel finally looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. "John, don't." I cut her off, standing up and grabbing my carry-on from the overhead compartment. "You've said enough." I turned back to Mark, my voice cold and final. "Enjoy your retreat, Mark. But remember, what goes up always comes crashing down. And when it does, I'll be there to watch." With that, I strode down the aisle, ignoring the whispers and stares of the other passengers. The flight attendant tried to stop me, concern etched on her face, but I brushed past her. I needed air, space, anything but the suffocating truth I had just confronted. As I stepped into the airport terminal, the weight of it all hit me. My world had just shattered at 30,000 feet, but amidst the rubble, a spark of resolve burned bright. Rachel and Mark thought they had won, but they had no idea what was coming. The morning after the flight, I stood in the empty kitchen, staring at the remnants of my old life. The mug Rachel used every morning, the wedding photo on the counter, the kids' drawings pinned to the fridge. My hands clenched into fists as the memory of Mark's smug face resurfaced. But rage alone wouldn't dismantle the empire he had built or expose the lies Rachel had spun. For that, I needed a plan, a methodical, calculated approach. I needed to fight back not with brute force but with intelligence. And I knew exactly where to start. Feigning acceptance of Rachel's betrayal was easier than I thought. I told her I needed space and focused on work, pretending to pour myself into a demanding architectural project. She didn't question it. Guilt made her compliant. It gave me the cover I needed to dig deeper into Mark's world. I started with public records, corporate filings, tax returns, and any financial documents I could legally access. Mark Turner wasn't just a CEO. He was the face of an international conglomerate with interests in everything from tech to luxury goods. His wealth was staggering, but so was his arrogance. It didn't take long to find whispers of lawsuits, allegations of insider trading, and rumors of unethical business practices. But whispers weren't enough. I needed something concrete. Enter Lisa. I remembered her from the gala where I first met Mark. Sharp, unassuming, and too smart to play into his charm. A mid-level accountant at Turner Enterprises, Lisa had the kind of access I needed and, as it turned out, a personal grudge against her boss. She had been passed over for a promotion 3 times in favor of Mark's cronies, and the resentment simmered just beneath her professional demeanor. It took a week of carefully crafted emails and discreet meetings at a local cafe to gain her trust. When I finally laid my cards on the table, she didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting for someone to take him down," she said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "This has everything you need: shell companies, falsified audits, money funneled through offshore accounts. But be careful, John. Mark doesn't play fair. With Lisa's help, the puzzle began to take shape. The USB drive was a treasure trove of incriminating documents. There were forged signatures on contracts, payments to regulators to suppress investigations, and even email chains where Mark's team discussed covering up environmental violations. But it wasn't just about Mark. I found Rachel's name intertwined in his schemes: receipts for luxury gifts charged to company accounts, first-class flights labeled as client meetings, and expense reports that conveniently aligned with her weekend trips. She wasn't just complicit. She was a willing participant in his empire of deceit. The plan began to take form: expose Mark's corruption, dismantle his reputation, and implicate Rachel in the process. But it had to be done carefully. A direct confrontation wouldn't work. Mark would bury me in lawsuits before I could get a word out. Instead, I would leverage the one thing men like him feared most: public disgrace. I spent weeks compiling a dossier, organizing the evidence into a cohesive narrative. Lisa helped me prepare anonymous reports for regulatory agencies, detailing the financial irregularities and environmental violations. At the same time, I reached out to a journalist at a prominent business magazine, someone known for taking down corporate giants. She was intrigued by the story and agreed to meet under the condition of absolute anonymity. The night before the story broke, I sat in the darkened living room, the dossier spread out on the coffee table in front of me. The weight of what I was about to do settled heavily on my chest. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice, about ensuring that men like Mark and people like Rachel couldn't destroy others without consequences. I took a deep breath, then hit send on the emails to the journalist and the regulatory agencies. The trap was set. As I sat back and watched the moonlight spill through the window, I felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since that fateful flight, I felt like I had control again. Rachel and Mark had underestimated me, mistaking my quiet nature for weakness. They would learn in time that my silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. And this was only the beginning. By noon, the financial headlines blazed with Mark's name, but not in the way his PR team would have preferred. Turner Enterprises under federal investigation. Whistleblower reveals massive fraud. Lisa's evidence, combined with carefully crafted leaks to both regulators and journalists, had turned a slow simmer into a roaring inferno. The SEC and FBI announced a joint investigation, freezing key accounts and subpoenaing Turner Enterprises for documents. Mark's face was plastered across every major network. The usual confidence in his features had been replaced by a grim, tight-lipped expression as he exited his office building, cameras flashing and reporters shouting. He issued a single statement: "This is a misunderstanding. Turner Enterprises has always operated with the highest integrity." But the world wasn't buying it. Behind closed doors, his board was in chaos. Investors were fleeing, and employees whispered of layoffs. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The gala that evening was a charity fundraiser Rachel had eagerly anticipated for weeks. Held at one of the city's most exclusive venues, it was the kind of event where the elite gathered to showcase their wealth and influence. I had feigned disinterest when she mentioned it, encouraging her to go with Mark instead. She took the bait. I arrived at the gala early, blending into the crowd unnoticed. My plan was meticulous, every detail timed to perfection. The journalist who had run the story was there, discreetly capturing reactions as the scandal brewed. Lisa, in a rare display of boldness, attended as well, a quiet ally in the sea of deception. Rachel and Mark entered together, turning heads as they always did. She wore a shimmering silver gown, her arm linked with his, their smiles the perfect facade. But beneath the surface, I could see the cracks, the tension in her shoulders, the forced nature of his grin. They were putting on a show, but I was about to bring the curtain down. As the evening wore on, I waited for the perfect moment. The lights dimmed, and the event's host took the stage, beginning a speech about generosity and integrity. Words that rang hollow in a room filled with those like Mark. It was then that I made my move. Walking up to Rachel and Mark, I ignored the curious glances from those nearby. My presence alone was enough to silence their conversation. Rachel's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in panic. "John," she began, her voice faltering. "What are you doing here?" I held out the manila envelope, my expression calm but firm. "Delivering something I should have given you a long time ago." Her hand trembled as she took it, and I watched as she opened the envelope, her face draining of color when she saw the divorce papers. Before she could respond, I turned to Mark, who was glaring at me, his jaw tight. "You wanted his power, Rachel?" I said, my voice cutting through the hushed murmurs of those around us. "Now you can share his downfall." Mark's smirk faltered, his facade cracking as he realized the weight of my words. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice louder than he intended. "You haven't checked the news today, have you?" I replied, tilting my head slightly. "You might want to. Your name's everywhere. Turns out, people don't appreciate fraud, environmental crimes, and laundering money through offshore accounts." Mark's face turned a deep shade of red as whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Phones were pulled out, news alerts flashing across screens. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting between me and Mark. The host on stage faltered, glancing toward the growing commotion. I took a step closer to Mark, lowering my voice just enough that only he and Rachel could hear. "You thought you were untouchable," I said, my tone cold. "But you underestimated me. This isn't just about what you did to me. It's about everything you've done. And now the whole world knows." As I turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of release. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, they were still there, but they no longer defined me. I had taken back control, not just of my life but of the narrative they had tried to write for me. Rachel called after me, her voice desperate. "John, wait." I paused, glancing over my shoulder. For what? Another lie? Another excuse? I shook my head, my voice steady. "We're done, Rachel. You made your choice. Now live with it." I walked out of the gala, leaving behind the life I had built and the people who had destroyed it. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Freedom. Mark Turner's empire would never recover. Rachel would face the consequences of aligning herself with him. And as for me, this was only the beginning of my new chapter. The house was quieter than usual. Too quiet. It had been 3 days since the gala, and the fallout was already consuming the headlines. Mark Turner's empire was in freefall, his board scrambling to salvage what little credibility remained. Rachel, now publicly entangled in his schemes, had retreated into silence. My children, however, were far from silent. "Why did you do it, Dad?" Emily's voice broke through the heavy silence of the living room. Her usually soft tone was edged with confusion and hurt, a stark contrast to the innocence I had always seen in her. I turned from the kitchen counter, where I'd been nursing my second cup of coffee for the morning. She stood by the doorway, her arms crossed and her face flushed with frustration. "Do what, sweetheart?" I asked, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. Her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Why did you humiliate Mom like that? Everyone at school is talking about it. They're saying awful things about her." Before I could answer, my son, Ethan, stormed in. At 16, he carried his emotions on his sleeve, his anger sharp and unfiltered. "You ruined everything, Dad. Did you even think about how this would affect us? Or was it just about getting back at Mom?" Their words hit me harder than I expected. The triumph I'd felt at the gala, the satisfaction of seeing Mark and Rachel brought low, suddenly felt hollow. I set my coffee cup down, the clink echoing in the quiet kitchen. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I said, my voice low but steady. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Your mother made choices that—" "Don't!" Ethan interrupted, his voice cracking. "Don't make it about her. She's still our mom." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say to that? He wasn't wrong. Rachel was still their mother, no matter how much she had betrayed me. And now, because of my actions, they were the ones bearing the brunt of the fallout. That evening, I found myself alone in the study, the weight of the day pressing heavily on my chest. The evidence of my revenge, Printouts, emails, and notes still sat in a neat pile on my desk. They had been tools of justice, but now they felt like symbols of something darker. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Emily stood there, her expression softer than before. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from me. She hesitated before sitting, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't understand why you had to do it that way," she said after a moment. "Mom made mistakes. I get that. But did you have to make it so public?" Her words echoed in my mind long after she left the room. I had justified my actions as necessary, but for the first time, I began to question if the price of my revenge had been too high. The destruction of Rachel and Mark's reputations had been satisfying, yes, but at what cost to my family? My children were caught in the crossfire, struggling to reconcile the image of their mother they once adored with the reality I had exposed. That night, I sat by the window in my bedroom, staring out at the darkened neighborhood. The life Rachel and I had built was gone, replaced by fragments that no longer fit together. My victory felt hollow, the sense of justice drowned out by the pain etched into my children's faces. I reached for the photo frame on the bedside table. It was a picture of all four of us at the beach, taken 2 summers ago. Rachel's smile was radiant, her arm around Ethan, while Emily clung to my side. It was a lie, of course, a snapshot of a moment that had already begun to crumble. But to my children, it was a reminder of what they had lost. I placed the photo back on the table and closed my eyes. The satisfaction of revenge had faded, replaced by a gnawing doubt. I had been so focused on exposing Rachel and Mark that I hadn't stopped to consider the collateral damage. My children were paying the price for my pursuit of justice, and I wasn't sure if I could fix it. The next morning, I called Emily and Ethan into the living room. They came reluctantly, their expressions guarded. "I need to apologize," I began, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Not for what I did, but for how it's affected you. I should have thought more about how my actions would impact our family. You didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this." Emily's eyes softened, though she didn't speak. Ethan looked away, his jaw tight. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," I continued, "but I want you to know that I'm going to do better. For you." There was a long silence before Emily reached out, her small hand resting on mine. "We just want our family back, Dad," she whispered. Her words hung in the air, a fragile hope that felt like a lifeline. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since the storm began, I felt a sliver of light breaking through. The courtroom was silent except for the rhythmic clicking of cameras outside, their flashes bouncing off the high windows. Mark Turner sat at the defendant's table, his once impeccable suit rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. He looked smaller now, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. Surrounding him were high-powered attorneys scrambling to mitigate the fallout, but the weight of the evidence was insurmountable. "Mr. Turner," the judge intoned, her voice firm but measured, "the charges against you include fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit insider trading. Your assets are hereby frozen, and you are remanded into custody until your trial." The gavel struck, its echo reverberating through the room. Mark flinched as 2 federal agents approached, placing handcuffs around his wrists. The cameras outside erupted into a frenzy as he was escorted through the courthouse, his downfall broadcasted to the world. In the back row, I sat quietly, my emotions a storm of vindication and exhaustion. Beside me, Lisa gave a small nod, her satisfaction evident. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and Mark Turner's reign of deceit was over. Rachel's world crumbled alongside Mark's. The scandal engulfed her as reports surfaced linking her to fraudulent expense accounts and unauthorized corporate gifts. She became a pariah in her professional and social circles, her former friends whispering behind her back at every event she dared to attend. When she returned home that evening, her usually confident stride was replaced by a faltering step. The children had retreated to their rooms, their trust in her shaken beyond repair. She sank into the couch, her head in her hands, as the weight of her choices finally bore down on her. "John," she called softly, her voice trembling. I stepped into the living room, keeping my distance. "What is it, Rachel?" I asked, my tone even but cold. Tears glistened in her eyes as she looked up at me. "I didn't think it would end like this." "You didn't think at all," I replied, my words cutting but true. "You chose Mark. You chose ambition over family. And now you're facing the consequences." She sobbed quietly, but her tears no longer moved me. They were too little, too late. The custody hearing was brief, the judge ruling in my favor without hesitation. Rachel's tarnished reputation and ongoing investigations left her with little ground to stand on. Emily and Ethan would remain with me, providing them the stability they desperately needed. As we left the courtroom, Emily clutched my hand tightly, her eyes scanning the crowd for her mother, who had disappeared without a word. Ethan walked beside me, his expression unreadable, but the way he stayed close spoke volumes. At home, I worked to rebuild what Rachel and Mark had tried to destroy. The kids and I established new routines: family dinners, weekend outings, and quiet nights watching movies. Slowly, the cracks began to mend, though the scars would remain. Mark's threats had been reduced to nothing more than hollow words, but he managed one final audience. At his request, I visited him at the detention center, not out of obligation but to hear what he had to say. Seated across from me, separated by a pane of glass, Mark's once proud demeanor had been replaced by desperation. He leaned closer to the phone, his voice a low growl. "You think you've won," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But you'll regret this, John." I stared at him, unflinching. "Not as much as you will," I replied, my tone resolute. His face twisted in anger, but I hung up the phone and walked away, leaving him to the cage of his own making. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily and Ethan joined me on the porch. Emily curled up beside me, while Ethan leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the fading light. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" Emily asked softly. I wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "It won't be the same as before," I admitted. "But we'll find a new normal, one that's stronger, because we'll build it together." Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I think we'll be okay," he said, his voice steady. As the stars began to dot the night sky, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I was ready to face it. Mark and Rachel had thought they could break me, but they had underestimated the strength that comes from protecting what truly matters. This was my ultimate justice, not just for me, but for my children, for our family, and for the life we were reclaiming. The early spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers, a sharp contrast to the storm that had consumed my life a year ago. The backyard was filled with laughter as Emily and Ethan chased each other around the garden. Their joy was infectious, and for the first time in what felt like forever, our home felt whole again. I leaned against the wooden railing of the porch, sipping my coffee and reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. The scars left by betrayal still lingered, faint reminders of the life we had lost, but they no longer defined us. Instead, they served as markers of growth, resilience, and the strength we had found in rebuilding. Launching my own architectural firm had been a daunting task, but it became the lifeline I needed. Designing homes that symbolized fresh starts and second chances mirrored my own journey. The business thrived, fueled by a newfound passion and a determination to succeed, not for revenge, but for myself and my children. Emily's artwork now hung proudly in my office, her talent blossoming as she found solace in creativity. Ethan, once burdened by anger, had channeled his emotions into sports, earning a spot on the varsity soccer team. Watching them grow and thrive brought me a sense of fulfillment I hadn't known I needed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a knock at the door interrupted our quiet dinner. Emily retrieved the envelope left on the porch, handing it to me with curious eyes. My name was scrawled on the front in a handwriting I recognized instantly. Rachel. I hesitated before opening it, the weight of the past suddenly pressing against my chest. Inside was a letter, its tone subdued and remorseful. "John, I don't expect forgiveness, but I owe you an apology. I was blind to the damage I caused, to you, to our children, to everything we built together. Mark's promises were empty, and the life I thought I wanted turned to ash. I've lost everything, but losing you and the kids is what I regret most. I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me, not for my sake, but for the peace it might bring you. Rachel." The words were heavy with regret, but they stirred no anger in me, only a quiet acceptance. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of my desk, choosing not to respond. Rachel's path was her own to walk now, just as mine was mine. That weekend, we celebrated Ethan's acceptance into a prestigious summer soccer program. Friends and family filled the house, their presence a reminder of the support that had carried us through the darkest times. As I stood amidst the laughter and warmth, Emily tugged at my sleeve, holding out a handmade card. "Happy anniversary," she said with a shy smile. I frowned, confused. "Anniversary of what?" "Of us," she replied. "Of getting through everything and being a family again." Her words brought a lump to my throat, and I pulled her into a tight hug, overwhelmed by the depth of her love and resilience. Ethan joined us, rolling his eyes but grinning nonetheless, and for that moment, everything felt perfect. Later that night, as the house grew quiet and the moon cast its gentle glow across the yard, I sat alone on the porch. The skies above were clearer than they had been in years, each star a reminder of the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift with the cool night air. The storm that had once threatened to destroy me had passed, and in its place was a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. "The skies are clearer now," I murmured to myself, a smile tugging at my lips, "and I've finally found my way back to solid ground."